and it will be available on the League's website. While our speakers are talking, we invite you to click on chat at the bottom of your screen and type in your own questions. I will be monitoring the chat. Also, if you would like to be part of the League's Google group for immigration, please type your email in the chat. In order to see subtitles for this session, you are welcome to click on live transcript at the bottom of your screen and select the subtitle option. Now, I welcome issue specialist Kim Reed, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jean. Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're with us this morning, and I'm especially excited to welcome Nubia Willman, from the Chicago's Office of New Americans, who's with us today. And after she is our featured speaker, and after she is done, we will hear from Fred Sau from the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights, who's going to give us an update on ICER's legislative state platform. So let me give you a little bit of information about Nubia. Nubia Willman is the director of the City of Chicago's Mayor's Office of New Americans. She is responsible for immigration policy and programming throughout Chicago to ensure the city remains a welcoming one. Nubia's work includes leading the city's census efforts, increasing language access, and working with community stakeholders to increase services of Chicago's immigrant and refugee communities. Prior to joining the mayor's office in July 2019, Nubia worked at Legal Aid Chicago. At Legal Aid Chicago, Nubia supervised the immigration project in the Immigrants and Workers' Rights Practice Group. She represented survivors of gender-based crimes, migrant workers, human trafficking survivors, and low-wage workers seeking immigration and employment relief. Nubia graduated from Loyola University School of Law in 2010 and is the editor of Latinas Uprising, an online community dedicated to increasing diversity within the legal profession. And we are so glad to have you here today, Nubia, and it's so nice to see you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get into it all. So I think, just give me a second. I'm going to share my screen so I can share my PowerPoint if that is okay. Second. Okay, can folks see this? Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm Nubia Willman. I'm the director for the Office of New Americans. And as Kim mentioned, I am in charge of immigration policy and programming for the city. So I'm really excited to talk to you about what it means to be a welcoming city. What do we mean when we say that? And then really dig into what is the future of immigration, and especially as we look at it through a women-centered lens, which I hope is a little enticing and entertaining for folks. And there will be questions at the end, of course, for time for questions at the end. So let's get started. So in order to talk about Welcoming City, I kind of want to tell you a story. I want to tell you about Gabriela. So we can go all the way back to 1984. We have Gabriela, who is a citizen, a resident of Guatemala. She's a national of Guatemala. And Guatemala at that time, and a lot of Central America, is going through a lot of economic turmoil. There's a civil war, there's a lot of violence, and the local military is targeting her and her family. So Gabriela flees to the United States because she knows that in the United States, she can apply for asylum. There's a new law, it's the 1980 Refugee Act. And so folks who are fleeing persecution in their home countries can apply for lawful status and become asylees. She comes to the United States, she ends up in Chicago, she applies for her asylum case, but it's denied. And she ultimately becomes undocumented. Now, Gabriela doesn't know that at that time, there are many Central Americans applying for asylum and that their cases tend to be denied. And she doesn't know that at the same time, many Eastern Europeans who are fleeing communist Europe are also applying for asylum through this Refugee Act, and their cases are getting approved at much different rates. She's not aware of that. She's not aware that there's some desperate situation happening. and just tries to live her life. So she's here in Chicago, she's undocumented, she joins a local church who learns of her situation and others like her. And the church at this point in time really takes on the mantle of immigration. Churches, since forever and continue to do so, have taken on social issues. They started to advocate on certain matters, and immigration is no different. We see a lot of history, especially beginning in the 80s, of churches taking on the social issue of immigration, of protecting their congregants into literally providing sanctuary and letting them live in their spaces. There's litigation. There is some federal litigation that eventually happens to against the federal government to say you are applying this law unequally. That does result in some good remedies for Central Americans. But Gabriela doesn't know all of that. She just knows that she's here, that she's living in Chicago, and that a church is helping her. And so this church starts to do some type of advocacy. They start to push the local government, they start to gain more information. And so we're a year later, it's 1985, and this activism comes to Mayor Washington's City Hall, which is where I am right now. And so Mayor Washington hears what is happening in the community. He sees what happens when communities are disrupted by what is then known as Immigration and Naturalization Services when there's raids. And he decides to sign an executive order. And this executive order prohibits the city from sharing information with INS and cooperating with their enforcement. And this is the foundation of our welcoming city. This is the beginning of Chicago's iteration of saying, we are going to protect our immigrants and refugees against the federal government. And so I want to take a moment here and talk about welcoming city versus sanctuary city, because we use and hear those terms a lot. And the reality is that there is no legal definition for either. And so folks use it often interchangeably. What we see is a trend that cities who sort of view themselves as sanctuary cities may often be focused very much on enforcement and protection of enforcement, whereas welcoming cities are cities that do protect from enforcement, but also are looking at ways to include and integrate their immigrant and refugee communities in a more holistic way. Both, again, some folks use them interchangeably. We in Chicago prefer the term welcoming city, as we hope to continue to build policies that are more inclusive and embracing of folks beyond just immigration enforcement. Now, of course, because there's no legal definition, this results in there not being any legal bite to when we say we're a welcoming or sanctuary city. What that means is that we can't stop ICE or the federal government in whatever iteration of immigration department they have from doing what's within their jurisdiction. And so sometimes that confuses people because we say we are a welcoming city, but then there's still raids. How does that happen? And it's because we can't stop them from doing, what they're entitled to do, but we can decide as a city to say, we are not going to help you do those types of things that we know disrupt our community. And essentially that's where we're at. So when we say we're a welcoming city in Chicago, we're really looking to embrace and encompass our refugee communities and protect them and protect their due processes as much as possible. And so we see this as the foundation of Mayor Washington's executive order. The Chicago mayors following him build upon this, and the activism in Chicago and the immigration world continues to grow as well. Eventually, we have the most recent iteration of Welcoming City, which when I talk about that, I mean the one from 2020, which says that any city resources must be accessible to all residents, regardless of immigration status. It says that we do not cooperate with immigration enforcement and that we do not share information to ICE of our residents, except for when there are 4 exceptions, which we commonly refer to as the carve-outs. And these exceptions kind of circle around what seems like criminality. If someone has a pending charge or a warrant out, things of that nature. And at the same time, before we get into those carve-outs, we have Gabriela. Now it's 2020, 2019. Gabriela is much older. She has children. Her children know about the fact that she is undocumented. They have grown up with the fear that she could get taken away. They have continued to do that advocacy. They have friends who are like their mother, who are undocumented themselves. We see undocumented youth becoming very much empowered through these past few years to say, we have a right to say what happens to us. We want to be able to advocate and say, this is the policies that work for us. And so we see this kind of swelling of work pushing toward this change of the narrative to say you cannot just label immigrants good versus bad, criminal versus non-criminal. Humans are way too complex to just say, well, we know who's the good one and who's the bad one. We can't really focus on that. And plus, these are groups of folks who know what happens, the fear and the damage that happens when someone is plucked from their home simply because they've been labeled bad. And so they're saying, we want you as a city to protect us from that and not so easily give away our family to the federal government simply because the federal government has said these folks are bad. So it's really a humanizing element, right? It's about seeing the humanity of immigrants, and that's really their main number one push. But it's also a due process issue, especially as a city, when we look at the situation and what we see that happens across the country, the idea of eroding someone's due process, of saying, well, if you say they should be taken away, then we're not going to do anything about it, it can become really sticky. And we have a lot of examples throughout the country where US citizens have been stopped and detained by ICE. And I don't mean just a detention in the sense of like when you get a speeding ticket and they let you go after 5 minutes. We have citizens who have actually been placed in detention, and they have to prove that they are a citizen. And it's not as easy as just, mom showing up with the birth certificate. It's a complex process once you're in proceedings. And so that raises some liability issues for the city as well, that we have seen happen in other jurisdictions that have cooperated with ICE enforcement. And then of course, it's just good policy because the data shows us that it is. It can seem on paper that saying, we won't support, people with criminal issues, but the reality is that when we look at the data and we look at the studies, cities where they do cooperate with ICE have not seen any change in their criminal rates, in their victimization of folks. It has not been a net positive. And in fact, we see the opposite. In places where we say we're not going to cooperate with ICE, we see immigrant and refugee communities with or without status who feel more comfortable going to the police and reporting crimes, reporting bad actors, because they know that they aren't putting themselves at risk. And so we see that this is actually a very beneficial, and it does make our community safer when we say we're going to protect folks and their due processes, full stop. So under the Lightfoot administration, when Mayor Lightfoot began, she did an assessment speaking to the activists and the organizers, and there was a need to remove the carve-outs. And in fact, she did issue an executive order of July of 2019 saying the police would not cooperate and kind of putting those exceptions to the side. Of course, as we know, executive orders are not as good as actual ordinances and laws. And so we had to keep working on this. There was some litigation that was occurring that prevented us from moving on this quicker. But eventually, at the end of 2020, it was time. And so the Welcoming City Amendments were introduced in December of 2020, which removed the 4 carve-outs and also provided protections for survivors of crimes. And so what this is an extra addition that says the police, when someone is a victim of a crime, is going to support them, and puts us aligns Chicago with a state law called the Voices Act, which helps support survivors of crimes. And it also removes the word citizen from the municipal code. Because we actually didn't mean citizen, a US citizen, when those ordinances are written. What often was meant was a public place or a person or a residence. And so removing that word and actually saying what we mean makes it a much more inclusive ordinance. And so we're really excited that that was voted on and passed in January of 21. And I'm really thrilled to mention that just 5 days ago, the Mayor Lightfoot signed this into law. And so this is a picture of her at the signing ceremony. So you are getting the latest news and the most up-to-date news. This finally went into effect this past week. And so the carve-outs are no longer there. We have extra support for survivors of crime, and we're having a more inclusive municipal code. So very excited about that. I'm just gonna check to make sure I'm not missing some. Okay, sorry. So next, I want to talk about, so that's Welcoming City in a nutshell and kind of the history of Welcoming City. But I want to talk a little bit more about the future of immigration and what it means, especially when we look at it through a woman-centered lens. And I think you'll see these are kind of all interconnected, even if we don't often talk about it. And to do that, I wanted to introduce you to Sarah. So Sarah it's 2019. She is a Polish national. She is living in Warsaw. She's studying for her master's, and she falls in love with an American. He's studying abroad, and before he comes back to Chicago, he proposes to her. And in Chicago, her fiance, Michael, applies for what's called a K-1 visa. A K-1 visa is for someone who is going to come over as a fiance. And so he's going to bring Sarah to Chicago so they can build their life here. And when she arrives to Chicago, they know that they have to get married within 90 days. Otherwise, her visa is no longer valid. Sarah arrives with a present. She's pregnant. And while she's very excited to build this new family with Michael, he is not super excited. He's pretty upset. And as the weeks progress, his demeanor starts to change. He becomes more emotionally abusive, more physically abusive, and controlling. And unfortunately, the 90 days pass and he refuses to marry her. And so now she's here in a foreign country, about to have a child, and he tells her that she can go back to Poland, but she can't take the child with her. And at the same time, Sarah can't leave her marriage and she can't start or her partnership, and she can't find work because she does not have any valid authorization to be here. And without valid authorization, you cannot lawfully work. Remember, she has a master's, so she could probably earn a good living, but she is not able to do so here because she does not have that immigration status. So what most folks decide in the situation is that they're going to stay with their child. They're not going to abandon their child. And so they stay here. Sarah stays, and she is unsure of how she's going to keep herself safe, but she's worried that if she calls the police, that he'll tell her about her immigration status. In fact, he's told her, if you call the police, I'm going to tell them that you're here without papers and they're going to take you away and you'll never see your child again. But one day the abuse proves to be too much and she does flee. She goes to a domestic violence shelter and she does file an order of protection. And at the shelter, an immigration attorney helps provide for her with some options. And so here are some relief that an immigration attorney, when they assess a person in Sarah's situation that's fleeing violence, is going to kind of go over to see if she's eligible for something. The first is asylum. So again, if you're persecuted in your home country and you can be persecuted based on gender-based violence, maybe you're eligible for asylum. Maybe there's an option called VAWA, which is Violence Against Women Act. It's for survivors of domestic abuse who are married to a lawful permanent resident or a US citizen. I put battered women in parentheses because that's still the lovely name that they use. But remember, Sarah wasn't actually married, so she's not eligible for this either. A T visa is for a survivor of sex or labor trafficking. That's not necessarily in Sarah's situation at the moment. Temporary protected status is another option for folks. It's for when someone is here in the United States, and then something happens in their home country, political strife or some environmental disaster. And so the government provides them with temporary protected status. Temporary is relative because that remedy tends to continue for many, many years because it's so hard for countries to restabilize. That's not the case for Sarah. Poland, for the most part, has been doing okay. One of the other options is called a U visa, which is for a survivor of a violent crime. This can include domestic violence. And in Sarah's case, she has filed an order of protection, and perhaps she will want to file a police report now that she knows that ICE won't be a factor and that she has this remedy available to her. Those are some options. As I'm giving them to you, I want you to see, if you notice, what kind of pattern is there? What's kind of the determinant to see if someone is eligible for a relief based on these humanitarian remedies? Beyond then, the only real option for Sarah is this family reunification. She has to have some type of family member, a spouse, to have come into the United States. And in most cases, this is how women arrive into the US, is through family reunification petitions. A spouse, a parent, a child can apply for someone. And of course, in the majority of the cases, the citizen or the resident applying for their immigrant relative is a normal person. They want their relative to be here. They love them. They want to support them, and things are okay. But the issue is that for family-based petitions, it belongs to the person with status. So they have the right to revoke it, just like Michael had the right to not move forward with that K-1 visa. And it leaves the person sort of beholden to someone, which can become a problem if that person actually is manipulative or controlling, which was the situation in Sarah's case. So Sarah has these options from the last slide, and all of her relief will be dependent on her own personal circumstances. But what we do know, and what the studies show, is that Sarah is more willing to consider her options once she knows that the police are not going to report her to ICE. And so when we flash back to Welcoming City, one of the things we talk about often is, of course, you know, the carve outs and making sure that folks' due process are protected. But I don't think we often really delve into how this is such a great tool now that the exceptions have been taken away to help address gender-based violence. This is going to be a great tool for legal advocates and for survivors to be able to build that trust and feel comfortable reporting crimes and filing for applications because they know that the city is going to protect them. And we don't talk about that a lot, but I think it's really important to kind of view and see those connections. And so keeping in mind the kind of the premise of Welcoming City, keeping in mind Sarah's situation and these kind of really traumatic based applications, let's talk about the future of immigration and its relief. So when we talk about what's going to happen with immigration relief, what has happened in the recent past and what happens often now is that it centers often around work and the value add of an immigrant, right? And of course, like who doesn't want someone to come here with a great STEM degree, who's a genius, who's gonna knock Silicon Valley out the door? Like, of course we want that. Who doesn't want that? We want someone highly educated. But what happens who do we leave out when we center it around STEM? Who is excluded when we are centering immigration relief based on the highly educated? Let's think about it, about who has access to those opportunities. Even here in the United States, who primarily receives STEM degrees? And when we talk about different countries who maybe don't have as much access to education, who is able to access higher ed degrees? If we have cultural differences where we say, you know, we're going to value education for a son over a daughter, who is then going to have the opportunity to apply for these type of value merit-based immigration relief, right? And so even though this isn't on purpose, no one's saying we only want to bring men over into the United States, it does create this type of exclusion. And when these exclusions happen, what results is that the opportunities for women that are primarily based on dependency of others, so family-based petition, and you just hope against hope that the person that's applying for you is a good person, or it's opportunities based on trauma. And I just find that really interesting. And we don't have enough time to delve into that, but I do want folks to think about that. What does it mean when the options really then are based on surviving some type of violent trauma versus thinking about ways that we can be more inclusive to folks that it does not necessarily rely on the fact that they've survived some type of violent crime? I think that's interesting. I hope you do too. And so when we are talking about immigration relief, as we are now, one of the things that you should ask, especially as an ally, is who is this valuing? Even on purpose or accidentally, who are we valuing with this type of relief? Who are we excluding? And how can we create a system that does not disempower or devalue women? Those are some important questions to ask. And so right now there is a proposed federal legislation that's going to provide relief for 11 million undocumented folks. And currently it does focus on essential workers, TPS holders, and folks with DACA, right? Youth and young adults. But of course, we have a long way before it reaches the finish line. And so there's going to be a lot of concessions. There's going to be a lot of changes, a lot of additions and takeaways. And so as those changes are happening, as we're getting closer to a finish line, you should keep asking, who are we valuing? Who are we excluding? And how can we make sure we continue to empower women rather than disempower them as we build these type of legal relief? And so I don't know the future of the federal immigration reform. That's not in my tool house or my portfolio, but I can tell you the future of Chicago. And so in Chicago, what we are committed to is being a safe city, one where Gabriella and families like her can feel empowered to engage and petition their government to get their needs met. We are committed to being a protective city for individuals like Sarah who need access to safety and support without fear. And we want to build on the foundation built by those experiences and crafted by city leaders to create a city that is welcoming for all. So that is my time, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Nubia. That was great. And I think we especially appreciate turning that focus on how these immigration policies affect women. I personally haven't really considered it from that perspective. And I like the idea of how we can empower women. So I have a few questions, and I think there are some in the chat that Jean will be bringing up. But my questions are, so, and this goes to what you were saying about how important it is for immigrant communities to be able to build trust with police, and that is one of the goals in having these welcoming city ordinances. So what has the reaction from the Chicago police been in regard to the welcoming city ordinance, and especially this new iteration of it, which is congratulations. We're so happy that was signed on Tuesday.
No, thank you. Yes. So our city departments are, including the police, are open and abide by their ordinances. And so this is a little bit of a bland answer, but so they've been following this policy in some form or another since July of 2019, and we've seen them follow it. They understand it's the rule, and there hasn't been a pushback. And Chicago, for the most part, especially CPD, has been signing U visa certifications and other things. Oh yeah, I don't have to share my screen anymore. Sorry. And so the police have been as open to it as any other policy change. Of course, we need to continue to help give them guidance and trainings, but we have not really seen a pushback. And I think most folks, especially once they get trained, especially on gender-based violence, they see the value of this trust building with communities.
Okay, thank you. That's good. That's great to know. So I just want to bring up, before we go to the chat questions, last summer, and albeit that was under a different administration, ICE was going to hold a so-called Citizens Academy, and that was eventually postponed, likely the result of objections and protests. Can you explain what happened and what the city of Chicago can do to prevent ICE from attempting similar programs in the future?
Yes, so that was there was so much happening before COVID. I think if folks even remember, a month before the pandemic really hit, they were going to send Border Patrol agents to the city. It was just one thing after another. And I think it was a real testament to the sense of an anger of the fact that we were doing welcoming city policies so well for various reasons. And so, yes, this ICE Academy was very problematic. This idea of teaching regular citizens what it meant to be an ICE agent. And I think they were going to get to do mock surveillances. And it was just very bizarre. We were very nervous about putting these types of resources into the hands of folks who maybe will straight up say are just xenophobic, right? So, and that obviously can lead to lots of issues. We obviously can't stop them from doing this type of work necessarily, but we were really ready and willing to respond. We were willing to work with the organizations who did a lot of advocacy, who did a lot of protests. I think there was planned protests as well, but ultimately because of COVID, and I think just the nature of this program and how things ended up, leaning, it was ultimately canceled. But I think what is important is that we had, especially on the ground, and obviously this isn't always led by the city, but really great organizers and advocates who are always ready to go. And the mayor also herself is ready to go. I've actually protested in front of ICE with the mayor, so she's always ready to go as well. And I think that's really what matters, is that you can't necessarily always depend on the city government to be able to stop it, but you have to build that coalition of groups to be able to say and respond and say, this isn't right.
Okay, thank you. Jean, so there are questions in the chat.
Yes, one is very interesting. It says, could family unification be filed with by someone who's appointed to represent the baby on behalf of the mother?
Oh yeah, that's a complex question. So and I'm a little rusty because I haven't practiced immigration with direct clients in a while. I think there's definitely some family petitions for family based on guardianship or adoptions. I couldn't speak to it on that level. My practice was very niche at Legal Aid. It was actually just around gender-based violence. But I'm sure there are some options, and maybe where there's a will, there's a way, but it's really complicated.
Thank you. Sometimes the simplest sounding questions are far deeper than, so
Especially in immigration.
how are you getting the word out to all segments of Chicago about this wonderful information you're sharing with us?
Yeah, so we are very lucky that we have amazing community partners. And I see Fred's name. ICER, of course, is just such a great organization that shares information and does so much coalition building. Chicago also, the city, funds what's called the Legal Protection Fund. And so the Legal Protection Fund is a group of both legal services, so mostly the National Immigrant Justice Center, and community-based organizations, the Resurrection Project. Who provide, NIJC provides free legal services for folks who need immigration help. And then the Resurrection Project does a ton of community engagement. Prior to COVID, they were literally doing knocks on the door to teach folks what to do if ICE came to their homes. And that worked phenomenally. So they're trusted voices, trusted messengers, and we use them often, work with them to share whatever information we think is vital.
What do you know about suburbs that have similar welcoming city ordinances?
Yeah, so there's a few of them. I believe Evanston has one, maybe Berwyn. We're very insulated here in the city. Certain other folks have them, and really a city can decide to make it as strong or as weak as they want. And I think a little bit of how they do that is moved by the residents. And certainly in Chicago, we have a deep history, and we have a large group of immigrants who are ready and able to do some advocacy. That's not necessarily the case in the suburbs, where some of the communities are a little bit newer. But we're seeing an upswell, and certainly hope folks follow the lead of the city.
And how can the state of Illinois support the power of welcoming cities?
So that's such a good question. I think we have a really great relationship with the state in terms of just, we're all very aligned in being welcoming and supportive. That can obviously be very different when there's different leaders at the helm. And it's sometimes really important for us to be able to coordinate. I think a great example of this is about almost a year ago, there was an issue with refugee resettlement, and it required all the leads of the city governments, city, state, and county to submit letters. And we had to do that in a coordinated effort. And if one of us had kind of said no, it would have really stopped it in its track. We would not have been able to receive refugees. And so it is important to do that type of community building even within the leads of the city. Mm-hmm.
And then Jean, I have a question that I want to ask Nubia. What can League members do to help support immigrants and refugees? You know, what advice do you give to us?
I love that question. I feel if you feel like you have a skill set, you know, I'm an attorney, so I always like do pro bono work. It's so important. But there's other ways to volunteer. You can be of service even if you're not a lawyer. You can certainly, I would encourage you to find the local groups in your area. It's not enough, you shouldn't need to reinvent the wheel. I think what's really important is that the immigration world and the advocacy that happens is very much immigrant led, and it's led by the folks who are being most severely impacted. So I think it's important to find agencies and organizations in your area and see what work are they doing and how can you be supportive of it. Even like you can also do like citizenship corners and help people apply for citizenship. Because there's a lot to do with that. So there's lots of ways to help. Mm-hmm.
And Jean, did you see any other questions in the chat that?
Not in the chat. You had an interesting one about the Citizen Academy. Were you going to ask that one?
I did. We addressed that, but I think I'd like to maybe close with, what do you love about your job? What makes you do what you do, Nubia?
Yeah, so another good question. So I did direct representation for about 9 years at Legal Aid, and I loved my clients. which not a lot of lawyers get to say because clients can be a little bit difficult, but my clients were so kind and trusting because they really needed the help. Again, most of my clients were survivors of domestic violence or other types of violent crimes. And what I saw was, again, that just humans are complex, and it's so easy in immigration, again, to say good, bad, like this person is bad and we don't want them here. But I had clients who had really complicated situations, things that most of us won't have to experience, like a mother who has to decide, do I steal baby food for my child? And they do, and then they get caught, and now they're convicted of a retail theft, you know? And so this is a bad person, or are they helping their family? So I love seeing those nuances, and I saw exactly like helping one person individually. Here in the city, I'm able to help a swath of people and really the spectrum of immigration. It's not just those folks who are in really dire straits, but I'm also able to help those who are doing really well and can come here and really invest in the city and help us grow and become even better. So it's a really nice change of pace. But I am really happy to be able to work with immigrants in all stripes and breeds here in the city and help them really make this place their home.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been,
Kim,
sure.
sorry, a couple more that have popped
Okay.
in the chat about action at the local level. Are there sample local ordinances that are available, and how can we advocate in the suburbs and outside of the city at the local level?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm gonna, when we kick it over to Fred, because their coalition is actually statewide. So I think they have really great ideas for what to do, especially in suburbs that are a little bit unfriendly. I think there's a special need for support there. But there's lots of different ways that we can be. I mean, Chicago is pretty good, I will say, and not necessarily based on my work. We've been doing really well in terms of policy for a while, but we are really hopeful to continue to elevate it. And there's always going to be needs and things that need to be advocated for. I will say, I do see one question that says you have to be a licensed attorney to prepare U visas. I think that's a really important question. Yes and no. We're always going to encourage folks to be attorneys and to go to attorneys, and to sign anything for someone, you have to be licensed or accredited. But there are lots of ways to volunteer if you have a language skill, or to help under the supervision of an attorney. There are ways to help get that done. And certainly that can be very helpful for folks, because a lot of legal agencies are under resources and need that as much support as possible.
Nubia, are you able to stay on a little bit longer and respond to questions that you see popping up in the chat to write answers to that we can save? Because I think that would be helpful. And I again just want to say thank you so much. This has been exciting and really informative, and it is a pleasure to meet you. And I hope that we get to hear from you, in the future, and maybe in person. That would be really nice. So
fingers crossed. No, well, thank you so much for having me. I hope it was informative. I was very happy to share the latest news. I will respond to some questions in the chat, and also put my email address. So if folks have any questions or follow up, please feel free to do that as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And now at this time, we're going to introduce Fred Sau. Okay, hello, Fred. Fred is the Senior Policy Counsel at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Among many other responsibilities, Fred provides updates and analysis of changes in immigration policies and procedures to ICER members and allies, and assists with the coalition's legislative and advocacy efforts. Fred is a longtime friend of the League of Women Voters and has informed us and guided us on immigration matters since our immigration study in 2005. So I'm not trying to age you, but we are right there with you. Fred's going to introduce ICER's 2021 state legislative platform, and I'll put the link to it in the chat. The League of Women Voters of Illinois is an ally of ICER's, and we support this legislative work, and we will be notifying our members of advocacy efforts for those bills that align with our positions going forward. So thank you, Fred, for being here today.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that so many people are joining us this morning. I'm Fred Sau. I'm the Senior Policy Counsel at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Before I start, I want to again thank Mayor Lightfoot and Nubia and the rest of the mayor's team for all of their work to get the welcoming ordinance amendments over the finish line. This is something that I personally have worked on for the last 5 years, and many other organizations partnering within the Chicago Immigration Working Group have also worked on for quite a long time. So it was finally good to, get the touchdown and finally resolve the remaining issues with the welcoming ordinance. I also want to say just a few quick words about ICRR. We are the state's largest multi-ethnic immigrant advocacy organization. We represent the diversity of immigrant communities, not just throughout the state, but also based on national origin, as well as a whole diversity of different types of organizations. Ethnic associations, social service providers, faith communities, educational institutions, labor unions, trade associations, you name it, we probably have some under our umbrella. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about our advocacy platform for this coming legislative session in Springfield. So every year, generally in the summer and fall, we survey our membership to identify priorities, what issues are of deepest concern to the communities that they serve, and what should we be working on, and can these issues be turned into proposals that we can then turn into state legislation that we would advocate for among the members of the General Assembly. This past year, this past summer and fall was no different, except the circumstances were, of course, very different. Many of our communities were dealing with the impact of the pandemic, not just with respect to health disparities and the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and Brown communities, but also the disproportionate impact on those communities of the economic losses, the shutdowns of businesses, the closures of the job losses, the closures of businesses and the like. We're also dealing with the context of the racial inequities that COVID only highlighted, but preceded the pandemic, and that were brought to national consciousness by the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. This past summer and since then. In putting our platform together, we identified 3 pillars: healthcare for all, economic security for all, and safety for all. So I'll go through fairly briefly what's included in each of these pillars. Obviously, in the wake of the pandemic, healthcare access is super, super important. Unfortunately, so many people are, do have limited access to quality healthcare, based on lack of healthcare coverage or lack of just good healthcare resources in their communities. So we're working on a couple of things. First off, we want to make sure that people who do not qualify for healthcare coverage, either under Obamacare or through employment, have some access to coverage. We have a program here in Cook County called CareLink through the county healthcare system that does provide a medical home for many uninsured individuals, including many undocumented immigrants. But that's not quite enough, and it only covers the county. So we want to try to expand Medicaid coverage to undocumented immigrants who currently lack access to Medicaid. We made a start at that last year by joining in a coalition called Healthy Illinois that won healthcare coverage for undocumented seniors through the state Medicaid program. We'd like to continue with that. There's already legislation that seeks to cover the rest of the undocumented population. We understand this is going to be a significant cost to the state, but we do want to try to move the age restrictions or the age limit, the ages that are covered forward to cover more people. So that legislation will be moving forward. On top of that, Illinois healthcare providers and hospitals are under state legislative obligations to provide charity care. That is to provide health care for certain individuals, regardless of their ability to pay. Unfortunately, what we've been seeing is some shortfalls among certain providers in their provision of charity care. So we are partnering with Cook County on what we're calling the Healthcare Transparency and Accountability Act that would set up reporting requirements for healthcare providers regarding their provision of charity care, and just so we have some measure, some documentation of who's providing what levels of charity care. So this is legislation that's already been filed by State Representative Camille Lilly, and we are partnering with Cook County government to try to get this passed on the state level. So that's healthcare for all. The second pillar is economic security for all, and there are two main pieces here as well. First off, this past May in the General Assembly, we were able to win an expansion of the immigrant services line item. This is the line item that funds citizenship and DACA services through the New Americans Initiative, as well as assistance for individuals who want more information or need need case management services in order to apply for state level medical assistance, nutritional assistance, or other forms of assistance. That's through the Immigrant Family Resource Program. So we won additional funding for those programs, but we also won $20 million in direct cash assistance for immigrant families who were excluded from federal relief. And this is primarily immigrant families who have an undocumented breadwinner, and because of that, they were none of the family members, including U.S. citizen spouses and children, did not qualify for the IRS payments that came out last spring. So what we want to do is to continue that level of funding, but also to seek additional funding. Last year we got 30 million. We're asking for 33 million. The additional 3 million is to provide even further funding for the New Americans Initiative in light of the new administration. We know that the Biden administration has pretty much said DACA is here to stay. We're already seeing an uptick in interest and demand for DACA-related services. So we would like to use that additional funding to not only pay for expanded DACA services, but also if Congress does pass a legalization program in whatever form, that could be a version of the DREAM Act, that could be an essential worker bill, it could be President Biden's more sweeping proposal for legalization for all undocumented immigrants. that's going to require some work as well. So what we'd like, so the $3 million that would go toward DACA services could also go toward expanding legal capacity to provide assistance for people applying for legalization under any of those programs, should they be enacted into law. So that's one piece of this. The second piece of this is an expansion of the state earned income credit. This is a program that provides economics assistance for working families with children and certain additional households as well. It's using the tax system to provide regular assistance, supplementing their earnings. So unfortunately, there are quite a number of classes of taxpayers who are not eligible for the earned income credit. The two most significant ones are undocumented immigrants who file their tax returns using not a Social Security number, but an individual taxpayer ID number, or ITIN, that undocumented people can get from the IRS. That's one group. The other major group is caregivers, who very often do not work on a regular payroll, but who are providing really essential services for children and the elderly individuals. So our proposal is to expand at the state level, expand the earned income credit such that these two groups and certain other groups of individuals are able to qualify for the earned income credit. So so legislation has also already been filed in the General Assembly to move this forward. This is something that in past years the governor's office has supported. We're hoping to get strong bipartisan support for this proposal as well. So that's the economic security bucket. And then finally, there's safety for all. There are two pieces here as well. One is what we're calling the Illinois Way Forward bill. This is in the spirit of the Welcoming City Ordinance. Think of this as the Welcoming City Ordinance, but statewide. So this legislation would restrict the ability of local police and sheriff's departments to communicate with and cooperate with and turn people over to ICE. So there are already several bills that we have been able to win at the General Assembly level over the past 4 years or so. The Illinois Trust Act, the Voices Act for survivors of domestic violence who need police certifications, the Keep Illinois Families Together Act, which stops deputization of local police, the private prison ban that stops for-profit immigration detention centers in the state. So Illinois Way Forward would continue in that trend, and much in the same way as the Welcoming City amendments, basically put a cap on what the Chicago police can do. This legislation would put a cap on what any local police department or sheriff's department is able to do as well. So we are moving forward with this legislation as well. I'm happy to report that Senator Omar Aquino has filed a placeholder bill for this. We're still working on the language and working with stakeholders to nail down the language as we move it forward. And then the final bill I'll talk about is an access to counsel bill. This would set as state policy that anybody who lives in Illinois or who is detained in Illinois, who is facing deportation and who is in deportation proceedings, should have access to an attorney. And it would also set up a process to develop recommendations as to what the best way would be to actually provide attorneys for all of these people who are facing deportation. Now, The Biden administration has announced that it is cutting way back on the range of people who would be subject to ICE enforcement activity. From what the previous administration had done. That said, people are still being arrested. People are still being deported. ICE is not going away completely. So long as people still face the threat of deportation, there is still going to be a need for individuals who are in that predicament to have good legal counsel, have good legal advice as they're working their way through the system. So we are working with Representative Jennifer Gon-Gershowitz and Senator Selena Villanueva on moving this legislation forward as well. So that is our platform in a nutshell. And I'm happy to take any questions regarding this. If you want any further information, I will put my email address in the chat. And I know Kim knows how to get a hold of me. So you can also steer your questions to Kim as well.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. That was really helpful, and you certainly have been doing a lot of work, and I know that the pandemic made it even more challenging. So I didn't see questions. I see thank yous to Fred, and Jean, correct me if I'm wrong here as you scroll through there. But I do want to reiterate that we are an ally of ICERS and that we support this state legislative platform. And as we review the bills and see how they align with our positions, we will support those bills that we can. And we did get permission to support the bill that was on the first iteration of this document, which is the legal counsel, representation for immigrants. So that is something that we have permission that we can help you with advocacy, with contacting legislators when it's time to do that. So how else do you see that we can help you?
Well, yeah, I mean, we obviously are going to need help in reaching, many members of the General Assembly, and keeping in mind that there are going to be many areas, particularly in the Chicago suburbs, where our representation among our membership and among immigrant communities is not quite as strong. So we are going to need allies to to help us reach certain members. And also understanding that the pandemic makes things really complicated as well. A lot of what's happening in Springfield this year is going to be remote. I've already sat in on and taken part in any number of different Zoom meetings with state senators and state representatives. Getting to those meetings, getting on their calendars is going to be really important. And I should say as well, I hope this doesn't come off wrong, but because session has been canceled up through the end of this month, state legislators have had time to to take meetings. So in a way, they may be somewhat more accessible because they're not commuting back and forth to Springfield. But so there does seem to be a bit more opportunity and a bit more leeway so far as getting to our state legislators.
Okay, that's good to know, and I think we saw some of that last spring as well, especially towards the end of the legislative session. So although they were in person, I believe, at the time, but. Thank you so much for your time and answering our questions and giving us this update. And we look forward to continuing working with you.
Sure. Thank you.
So we truly appreciate Ms. Willman and Mr. Zhao joining us today. We thank all of the concerned audience members who also joined us and contributed questions. Again, if you would like to be added to the Immigration Google group, please type your email in the chat. We will be posting recordings of this and the other programs, and as well as supplemental resources on the League website. Just go to lwvil.org, scroll down to Issues Briefing, and click on Resources. If your questions were not addressed, please feel free to send them to issues@lwvil.org. And now please join us at 11:45 for redistricting in 2021, community mapping. How can we, the people, influence the way district boundaries are drawn for our local, state, and federal legislative bodies?